the culture a reflection of the organization, or is an organization a reflection of a culture? I've got a very strongly held point of view about what actually creates a healthy Agile culture. And I'm gonna be like really super transparent about it. I think a lot of times when we look at an organization that's struggling to adopt Agile, we see resistance, right? We see leadership behavior. We see resistance to change. We see people that don't want to participate. And it's very easy to say that we have like this command and control culture, or we have this, our leaders need to step up, or people need to behave differently. My belief is that most of the resistance that we experience in large organizations is because like the fundamental like operating model, the way we structure teams, the way we do governance, what we measure and control is fundamentally out of alignment with what we're trying to accomplish with Agile. So it feels like a culture problem. It feels like a resistance problem. It feels like a I don't want to change problem. But in practice, to me, my observation is that it's more like we're not operating in a system that encourages Agile behavior. So it's like, which comes first? Is the culture a reflection of the organization, or is an organization a reflection of a culture? And that's what I want to unpack a little bit. And the reason why this is so important to me is, if you guys aren't familiar with me at all, I run a boutique consultancy based in Atlanta called Leading Agile. And what we exclusively focus on is Agile transformation. And from my point of view, like it's a very dicey game to walk into a room full of senior leaders and tell them that they're too command and control and they need to do something differently. Anybody a senior leader ever been told by an Agilist that they're too command and control and they need to trust their teams? Yeah, for sure, right? The challenge is that as leaders, right, we have a business to run. We have software we have to put in market. We have customers that we have to serve. We have dates that we have to hit. We have financial objectives that we have to adhere to. And so for the leaders to kind of relax a little bit, they have to have a trusted system that they can delegate into. They have to be able to put in dollars and resources and people and all those different things. They have to be able to get a reliable, predictable outcome on the backside. And in the presence of that, I believe that a really healthy Agile ecosystem can emerge. When you're asking somebody to change, you're not necessarily just asking them to change the way they work. You're asking them to, I think the point over here, to put their career on the line, right? Everything that they've known and that they've been successful with over the previous 25 or 30 years. And again, it gets visceral. It's your house. It's your kids in college. Right? It's your sense of identity, right? Those kinds of things. So a lot of times it's like we come in as enthusiastic Agilists and we're trying to cast a vision of what's possible. But what I think we don't do a great job all the time of doing is bridging the gap between where we are today and where we want to be in the future. How are we going to get to this panacea of stuff? There's again, I can never remember the author, but you guys remember that comic? It was like two scientists standing at a whiteboard. There's a bunch of math on one side and a bunch of math on the other. And then it was like then a miracle happens, right? And he goes, I think you need to be more explicit in step 2. I think as Agilists, we're not always great at articulating step 2. We have a vision for where we want to go, but we're not always great at how to get there. So the end of the story, what I'm going to try to put a bow on this at the end, is that I believe that culture, behavior change, all of that kind of stuff is a product of a functioning ecosystem. And so how you form teams, how you govern the work, how you handle dependencies, how you do project intake, how you do investment decisioning, how you tie the organization to OKRs, KPIs, how you manage change, right? All of that kind of stuff is the most fundamental underpinning to how you change culture. And then when you get that operating model using really solid industry standard practices, Scrum, extreme programming, SAFe, large-scale Scrum, all that kind of stuff. So we get the systems, the teaming strategies, the governance models working. We enable it with the practices that we're so passionate about. And then what we're able to do is we're able to invite participation. We're able to invite hearts and minds to change. We're able to invite people to be less command and control and more empowering, because now they have an alternative to get what they need out of the system without having to resort to the tactics that they used to try, okay? So that's the end of the story, okay? So what I want to do to get there, so by the way, if you're interested in this deck, you can text culture to 33777. Thank you, Tim and my marketing team, for setting that up. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through, I want to get your sense about what is an Agile culture. Then we're going to talk about why an Agile culture is important. I want to talk a little bit about who is responsible for an Agile culture, and then how we get there. And then that's where we're going to connect some of the dots here a little bit. And we'll see if I can pull this off in the next 30 minutes or so. Okay, so what is an Agile culture? So you think about what Agile is trying to do. So when we say a small, complete, cross-functional team that basically works with a product owner on that backlog, what we're saying is that we have a cross-functional team organized around value with a single voice of the customer that is able to produce a working tested increment at the end of every sprint and get feedback from an actual customer on it. I do a talk that it's kind of gotten interwoven into kind of what I talk about. I call it the three things. So teams, backlogs, working tested software. And when somebody calls me up and they say, hey, we're struggling with Agile, I never ask them about, have you been to training or Scrum or whatever. The first thing I ask about is, what is your teaming strategies? What are your teams organized around? Do those teams, are they able to operate off of a well-articulated backlog? Are they able to produce a working tested increment? First time I ever did that talk, Daniel Gullo invited me to a Scrum gathering in Las Vegas, and gosh, like 12 years ago or something, it was a long time ago. And 500 Scrum practitioners in the room, and I asked, like, who forms teams the way Scrum prescribes forming teams? Who has product owners that can produce authoritative backlog the way Scrum recommends us doing that? How many can produce a working tested increment at the end of every sprint? Like 3 people in the room raised their hand. So here's the deal, right? Here's the deal. So a team that's not well formed, operating off of a random, ill-described backlog, not able to produce a working tested increment at the end of every sprint, is that a reliable system that organization can count on to produce something? I would suggest not. So now we're saying to our leaders, stop being so command and control. I need you to empower the team. I need you to trust the team. I need to let the team make the decisions about what's the right thing to do. And the teams can't produce what they're responsible for producing. They can show up, they can do Scrum, they can go through the motions, but they can't produce the actual thing that Scrum is designed to produce. So we say, is that a culture problem? Or is that a system of delivery problem? Would you demonstrate those cultural attributes as a leader if it was your organization and you were on the hook for producing that software? I might argue that you wouldn't, right? So in order to achieve the cultural attributes that we want, I would suggest we have to get our teaming strategies, our backlog strategies, and our working tested software strategies right. And when we don't get those teaming strategies right and we don't get the practices right, it's really difficult to create the culture that we want within the organizations. And we want people to be open, we want people to respond to change, but it's unsafe to do so. So why is an Agile culture important? So if you had an Agile culture, what would you do with it? How would it contribute to the success of your organization? How does culture map to business results? So I want a culture where I can respond to change. Well, what Agile does, which is brilliant, right, is it takes what I call, so I'm kind of in the small team realm. I'm not really thinking scaled organizations at this point. But for a single team, I have analysis, design, build, test, deploy all within the same team. I have a backlog that is written as user stories that describe behaviors, right? So I go back to like Bill Wake, Mike Cohn, independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, testable, right? The way that we write user stories creates the ability to pull something out and to put something new in. The way that we do technical practices with continuous integration, continuous deployment, TDD, pair programming, right, all those kinds of things, it makes it super safe to change the code base. So there's something in the structure of that team, the way the requirements are written, the way the technical practices happen, that actually enable me to live that cultural value. So, we have Dave Pryor as our CSM. He works with us in Leading Agile, right? And so he and I went down this path of, everybody that kind of goes to CSMs nowadays are like recovering project managers, right? And you get these funny questions like, how do I do Agile if I don't have product owners? How do I do Agile if I don't have a complete cross-functional team? How do I do Agile if I'm matrixed across 6 or 7 teams? Right? What I've found is that, and literally every one of our clients is in this boat, right? Because they wouldn't hire us otherwise, because this is what we do. It's like you can get an organization to change its teaming strategies if you create a compelling enough reason. You can measure the change, and you can measure the results of the change. Like, you can get them to change. So Al Shalloway, years ago, leader of Net Objectives, sold to PMI, inventor of the Flex system. I don't know if you guys know Al. I know he's been around in this community for a while. But he wrote a post that I thought was really interesting. And he basically said something to the effect of, when you take an organization that's in chaos and can't produce anything, and you run an Agile pilot, you create all of the conditions necessary for that pilot to be successful. Oh, and by the way, we use Scrum. Okay? And what happens is when you create all the conditions for that pilot to be successful and you enable it with a set of practices like Scrum, what tends to happen is that Scrum gets the credit, right? So we take the Scrum practices and we transplant them into the chaotic organization, right? How many people have ever seen Scrum work well on top of a functionally siloed organization that can't produce a working tested increment every 2 weeks? Just doesn't, right? But that's largely what we're doing, right? And that's the reason why I think, this is such a simple message that I'm exploring with you guys. But it's like, we see culture as the resistance. Sometimes I'll run this exercise. It's one of my favorite user group things to do. As I say to a room full of Agile enthusiasts, I go, okay, cool. So you're king for a day. You can do anything that you want to this organization. You can wave a wand and people will believe whatever you want them to believe. They'll be excited about whatever you want them to be excited about. They'll just like, they'll change their culture. You'll change their cultural attributes. They'll be different leaders, whatever you want them to be. And what you've got to do now is you've got to tell me what you would go do tomorrow, understanding that we have to produce a release in 3 months. So if you could wave a wand and wipe away all your cultural challenges, what would you go do tomorrow? But you're on the hook for delivering something in 3 months.
Get the same problem in 4 different teams.
You have the same problem in 4 different teams? Oh, it's interesting. Yeah, cool. I don't know that that's necessarily the way that, like, to me, where my brain goes is I'd come up with a teaming strategy. I'd make sure that all those teams had really solid backlogs. I would make sure that all those teams have the ability to produce a working tested increment at the end of every sprint. I would make sure that they're consistently running Agile practices across all the different teams. In the presence of dependencies, I'd put a lightweight orchestration mechanism on top of it. I'd tie it up to strategic intent, right? OKRs, KPIs, all that kind of stuff, right? And I would have a reasonably good shot in that environment of producing that working tested increment. The reason what you're saying is that because I haven't given that leader a compelling alternative to get what they need out of the system, they won't let me try, right? And what I believe is that if you can create the right conditions and make a case that those changes are going to produce the right results, you can create momentum in an organization to make more of those changes. What's the alternative, right? And this is where I think like Scrum is by default, right? Generally, when you take a training-first approach, like I'm going to teach you how to do Scrum, and then what happens is that we start doing Scrum. Scrum Master identifies the impediments. Scrum Master works with the organization to remove the impediments. Right? Team improves over time. That's kind of the training-first hypothesis. What happens when those impediments are org design? What happens when those impediments are technical dependencies in a tightly coupled mainframe legacy system? Right? What almost always ends up happening is that Scrum gets bent rather than the organization getting improved. SAFe gets bent rather than the organization improving. So as Agilists, I believe to become an effective Agile delivery ecosystem, we have to get the structure and the governance and the metrics in place. We have to get the dependencies understood. We have to put in the systems. Then we can enable it with Agile practices all day long. And then what will happen, and this is what I think is super cool, and it happens almost every time, is that people will learn how to trust that system and how to engage with it in a more healthy way. Once they realize that teams have a stable velocity against a known backlog and can produce a working tested increment at the end of every sprint, then they learn that if I mess with that team, if I meddle in its internal workings, I'm actually going to jack it up. Right? If I redirect it, if I pull people out of it, if I disrupt the system. So the behavior changes that we want to see from leaders come from giving those leaders a reliable system of delivery that they can delegate into. So I was up doing something at Wachovia before the Wells Fargo acquisition in Charlotte. And I was pretty new to the Agile world, and I was pretty new to version 1. And I was doing some basic tooling training, some basic Agile training. And a young woman in the background, she's like, I'm talking through all the cadences. And she goes, well, I have to go to 6, I'm on 6 projects. So I have to go to 6 daily stand-ups, 6 reviews and retrospectives, 6, everything, right? And I was just like, how do I protect that person's time in that world, right? And that's what I think is like super hard, because it requires an absolute rethink, right? One of the big buzzwords that you hear nowadays is this idea of projects to products. It's just really what we've been talking in the Agile community about for the last 20 years, right? How do I organize teams around persistent value and give those teams consistent funding so that they can stay together and produce product over time, right? That's like the very definition of Agile, right, at the end of the day. Okay, so I think this will be the last question I get to ask you guys. Who's responsible for an Agile culture in an organization? It's like, there's this whole thing in the Agile world around you have to trust the people doing the work, right? And I agree with that, right? We have to trust the people doing work. But we have to put them in an environment where they can be trustworthy. So most of the time when we come in and do transformation work, there is an element of asking the leadership team to suspend disbelief for a minute, right? Let's let these teams form. Let's let them get their backlogs together. Let's let them start to establish stable velocity, get to a place where they can produce a working, tested, validated increment at the end of every sprint. And then what's going to happen is you're going to expose a whole new set of levers to that leadership team. If they keep everything the same, then you should start to be able to, over time, start to understand how long it's going to take or how much scope that team's going to be able to get through using Agile. If they want to change their mind all the time, they should be able to insert new work into that backlog and understand the cascading impacts of inserting that work and what it does to everything else. Okay, but only a team that's well-formed, stable velocity, known backlog, able to produce a working tested increment at the end of every sprint will achieve that. So the general rule when I think about culture, it comes down, so much of it just comes down to trust. And so what I ask is that the teams have to focus on being trustworthy. They have to be able to do what they say they're going to do. They have to be able to operate with some degree of predictability. And then what we ask is the leadership to then respect that capacity, respect that predictability, and not jack with the system, and not overload the system. So once the team has stable velocity established, once it has a stable capacity indicator, then the organization has to balance demand against that capacity. And what we find is when we have really healthy teams where capacity and demand is in balance, right, all the other things start to snap a grid. Okay? So I had one more set of slides, but I think this is enough. And so the gist, again, is that if you want to change culture, it's super easy to point at the people in the system and to tell them that they need to change. And so what I'm suggesting is if you get the system of delivery, the organizational design right, get everything in alignment, and enable it with all the Agile practices, you will have a way easier road to hoe in trying to get people to change hearts and minds. So that's kind of the key point. Any other thoughts, questions? I'm hanging out here all day, you know. Feel free to come up and ask me questions if you want, but thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it. Yep.